point out that this is Deirdre's second visit to the University of Richmond in 1 year, one academic year. So we've been really fortunate.
Go Spiders!
And I understand that one of our Spiders was drafted last night.
Yes.
Really? Yeah. Craig Knightka, sitting near the back, actually taught.
Not basketball.
Yeah, basketball. Not a basketball. So Deirdre McCloskey, another distinguished professor whose work we're all familiar, many of us are, having read it or thought about it, both read it and thought about it. Those of you who are graduate students, we're just really lucky to be able to be here and see Deirdre in person. And those of us who've known her for many years are also very lucky to have her here, not just for what she's going to do today, which would be fabulous, but as you saw this morning, for the questions she'll ask and the way she's going to push us all constantly, because she's a
Keep talking for a while.
She's a Knightian. Okay,
I'm
well,
almost
there's something on the board here that I just wanted to remind people of, not Deirdre's stuff, but if you're a Twitter person, there's a hashtag there, and also I wanted to remind you to friend us on Facebook and so on, Jepson School Leadership Studies, and you'll see things posted there and so on. All of these talks, to the extent that people let us, will be put on YouTube after, once we get it organized afterwards. So if you miss a talk or whatever, you can look for it. Or if you just, you were listening to something this morning and you think, God, that was a really interesting part of the conversation, and I just, I've got the paper, but I don't have the conversation in front of me, and I want to hear what James Buchanan said. You can listen to it later on. I will say we keep track of hits and so on, and Jim's talk last year way more than Cameron's last year. I think you're quite a few too. And we expect you to look at many hits as well. And I'm going to stop talking soon.
Okay, in a few minutes. In a few seconds.
Let's see.
Doesn't she have books out or something?
Yeah, I do.
Actually,
I'll go
that
first.
reminds me. So we have Summer Institute T-shirts, which we'll get out later, not today, but later. But we also have copies of the Street Porter and the Philosopher, Conversations on Analytical Egalitarianism, which is a theme that Deirdre and David and I think Dave Colander and all of us share, and some other folks in the room share, which is that people are essentially people, and it's all the division of labor and specialization, which it makes them end up being a philosopher or a street porter at the end. There's a really interesting exchange between Buchanan and Warren Samuelson that starts that, where they had a sort of debate at one of the summer institutes, and then all of the papers are from basically the first 5 years of the Summer Institute, except that at the end we end it with a literary exchange, a written exchange between Buchanan and John Rawls. So it's a really interesting set of papers. We'll bring those books down here, and if you've not got a copy of it, I know there's some new people here, you're welcome to take a copy. And Deirdre might even sign it, since it has paper in it. She'd be glad to. So, without any further ado, I'm exhausted. Deirdre McCloskey.
Okay. Thank you very much. I have a back problem, and I walk from the food practically killed me. So I'm just going to sit. I ordinarily stand, but I'm going to sit. First proposition. Around 1900, ethics began to be expelled from economics and from the intellectual world of the West generally. Its expulsion, taking ethical talk out and sending it away to the theological seminaries and so on, sending it away, came about in a somewhat strange way. Without any evidence that this was a good way to go, economists and philosophers indeed started to say that ethics is a matter of opinion. And by that they meant not considered opinion, argued out opinion. You say this, I say that. Let's see, what do we have in common? Where do we not agree? But unconsidered opinion. You were said, after 1900, say, to feel about the ethics of abortion the way you feel about ice cream. Ethics, therefore, was supposed to be undiscussable. And you've heard this morning from Jim. He kept saying that. He kept denying he said it, and then he'd say it again. And then we had some more of that from David. If I said I like vanilla ice cream, which happens to be true, it would be idiotic for someone here to start arguing with me. Oh no, you don't really like vanilla ice cream. That's a dumb thing to like. What's wrong with you? So that theory, this theory, is called in the trade, in philosophy, is called emotivism. The idea being that ethics is a matter of emotion, of emoting. Oh, I believe that Jesus Christ is my personal Savior. No argument. Or more transparently, but also in philosophy, this is known as the hurrah-boo theory of ethics, in which ethical statements, unjust wars are bad, for example, can't be discussed, can't be argued about. You can only say hurrah or boo. Hurrah! It's unethical to have unjust wars. Boo! It doesn't matter whether they're unjust wars or are the way the things work, and that's how it should be. So, such as Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great American jurist, said, ethical and aesthetic preferences are more or less arbitrary. He said this in 1902. Do you like sugar in your coffee or don't you? He also said in that same year, our tastes are finalities. Now, you'll recognize this as economics, as Samuelsonian economics. Our tastes are finalities. Our utility functions are as far as you can go. Our behavior functions are as far as you can go in talking about tastes or arguing about tastes. In the fourth year of the Great War, 1918, he wrote to his friend Harold Lasky, when men, and I think the men is rather significant here, when men differ in taste as to the kind of world they want, the only thing to do is to go to work killing. Now, the Chicago School, really in all three of its versions that we were talking about this morning, the real good old Chicago School, as I regard it now, the school of Frank Knight, and the what I'm now going to call the pretty good old Chicago School, which I experienced as an assistant and associate professor there of Ted Schultz and Gary Becker, George Stigler. And then what I call Nouvelle Chicago, which took hold when I left. I think I must have caused it. Which, as you were saying, David, or someone was, merged into the conversation of economics more generally. All of them agree with Gary Becker and George Stigler in their famous paper, De Gustibus non disputandum est. Those of you who haven't had the vast amounts of Latin that I have will need to know that that says, of tastes you should not dispute. Mark Blaug said in 1980, there are no methods of reconciling different normative value judgments other than political elections and shooting it out at the barricades. There's a sort of a masculinist tone to all this. By proofs, Mark appears to mean, or by methods of reconciling, he appears to mean something like geometry. Not what Adam Smith meant by the faculty of speech, which, as he said famously, at least famous in my little world, everyone is practicing oratory on others through the whole of his life. I believe that's true and important. And again, in this turn to anti-ethical talk, Schumpeter, we may indeed prefer the world of, here, this is ridiculous. We may indeed prefer the world of modern dictatorial socialism, this is 1942, he's saying this, to 43, to the world of Adam Smith, or vice versa. But any such preference comes within the same category of subjective evaluation as does, to plagiarize Zombart, a man's preference for blondes over brunettes. And then Lionel Robbins in 1932. If we disagree about ends, it is a case of thy blood against mine, to live and let live according to the importance of the difference or the relative strength of our opponents. If we disagree about the morality of taking of interest, then there is no room for argument. Now, my personal story. I was at a meeting of the executive committee of the American Economic Association in 1996, January of 1996. Now, it was kind of an exciting meeting for me because it was my first meeting as Deirdre. And everyone was very courtly and it was fine. But there was a proposal that came through the secretary, a letter which had been sent to the executive committee by some outsider to the powers that be in the American Economic Association. And this guy suggested that economics, like every field around it, as David pointed out this morning, accounting, statistics, history, political science, sociology, English, all of them have codes of ethics. And it was proposed that, this was 1996, that we economists develop a code of ethics. And there was a stunned silence in the room. People were very unused to hearing such talk. And into the silence, someone, thank God it was not me, dropped the sarcastic remark, yeah, and the first rule would be don't ever predict interest rates. And we all laughed, to my shame, including me, and that was the end of the discussion. of whether we should have a code of ethics in economics. Now, of course, the Chicago school people, old or new, well, some of the new and some of the old, it's not universal, I can tell you, were ethical. Denying the force of ethics, then, in human and even economic life is, in a way, what the sociologists or English professors perhaps call a performative self-contradiction. You say, no, we don't need ethics to be economic scientists, we don't need to talk about that, and then you behave in an ethical way. When I was young in Chicago, Friedman and Stigler, where I overheard the following conversation in the coffee room of the social science building, and that went something like this. Stigler said, Milton, of course, they were tremendous friends, so this business of loving people but then arguing with them very strongly was what they were doing. Milton, you're such a preacher. If people want free trade, they'll get it. If they don't want it, no amount of jawboning by economists will change their minds. Friedman said, that's the distinction between us, George. We both admire markets, but you think they're already working. In this case, the political market, which is what Jim was talking about this morning, that there's a kind of market, sort of a market, that doesn't work very well as a market. We can agree with that. You think there's an equilibrium in this market. Stigler said, and why not? People are self-interested and they vote their pocketbooks. I once had a big argument with him about that. Friedman said, no, people are self-interested, but often don't know what their interests are. They need education. I'm a teacher. And I think that people do some things because they're ignorant. And if you knew Milton, that's how he felt. Everyone he met was ignorant and was in need of instruction. And Stigler said, and I'm a behavioral scientist. I assume rationality. And Friedman said, and I advocate it. So I think contrary to what Jim was saying this morning, although I don't know if he would accept this characterization of what he said, ethics is discussable. And it was discussed before 1900 in a utilitarian way, a way we're all quite familiar with in economics, or in a Kantian way, if you don't know that, go over to the philosophy department, or the way that it was discussed before the middle of the 18th century, universally, was in a virtue ethical way. And I'd like to tell you about that. Here's a diagram from a wonderful book that you can buy. I don't care if you read the book. I don't care. The Bourgeois Virtues came out in 2006 from the University of Chicago Press. And it's called Bourgeois Virtues, Ethics for an Age of Commerce. And it's just what its title says. It's an attempt to show what an ethics of a bourgeois society could be, or is, or ought to be. It's kind of all three. By the way, there's also, I'm not going to be talking about this, but I pause for advertising. Commerce. This is volume 2, published last year, Bourgeois Dignity. Why economics can't explain the modern world. And it's more, that book, the one before, is theology and philosophy, sociology, some psychology, English department stuff as well. This one is all economic history. All the economic history you ever want to know is in this book. They're available cheap on Amazon.com. I urge you to buy them. Now, has anyone got a pointer?
I do.
Yeah. Could you do it to me? Because as you can see in this chart, I've got seven, what I call seven principal virtues. This is in the tradition of virtue ethics. Is working. Does anyone have one? Does anyone else have a pointer? No, it's okay. No, it's not that important. I'll just point. You can see it's not that complicated. I should have brought them. These seven virtues, I claim, are the primary colors of an ethical life. They're the irreducible primary colors. You can't reduce them, for example, all to prudence, which is the bottom one there. P. That's what Jeremy Bentham tried to do in 1789, and it's the impulse of most Samsonian economists, is to say, well, okay, you want a utility function with 7 terms, okay, max U. But what's important to understand is that these are not only not fungible, not reducible to each other, but in many cases they're tragically insubstitutable. The human condition is that we love and we have prudence. So should we take care of our aged mother? Love says one thing, prudence, I gotta finish volume 3, says another. And without multiple virtues that we pursue in our stories more or less unsuccessfully, we have kind of a snappy one virtue account of life. Prudence only is Samsonian economics. It's Bentham. P. Justice plus some prudence is Kant. But this is the way that the West viewed the full human life before the 18th century, and which has been revived, very interestingly, very largely by female philosophers from the 1950s on. Anscombe and Murdoch, Martha Nussbaum's involved in this. I am. So, all right, there are these 7 virtues. Quickly, prudence is prudence. Prudence is phronesis. Prudence is practical wisdom. Prudence is that engineering that David was talking about. Know-how, savoir-faire. Now, I remember when the guys at Texas A&M first showed that rats and pigeons are rational. They showed that rats regard cherry soda as a superior good. They're choosing between food pellets, water, and cherry soda. As their income goes up, they consume more cherry soda and less water. And we were all very excited by this. Look at the range of economics. Wow! It applies even to animals. But of course, in a way, it's a catastrophe for economics, because it shows that, my favorite way of saying this is to assert what is true. Grass is rational, because grass seeks the light, it seeks the water, in a way optimal to the life goals of grass. And so there's something terribly wrong with saying what's unique about economics is prudence only. Or at least what's unique about human beings is prudence only. All right. Then there's temperance, T, which Adam Smith called, who, by the way, was the last of the former virtue ethicists. Adam Smith's theory of moral sense is a virtue ethic. Adam Smith called it self-command. The command over impulse. I failed in attempting to control myself from taking the second piece of pizza. I have to know it. Justice is balance in the society, ethical balance in the society, in the same way that temperance is balance inside a single person. It's according to people what you owe to them. All right? Courage is courage, except to point out that it's not only battlefield courage, it's all kinds of courage. It's a kind of courage that we all need in our lives. And you can sort of test whether or not this is an adequate philosophical psychology by leaving out one of these virtues in some idiosyncratic form that fits your own way of life and seeing that it wouldn't work. If you didn't have some sort of courage, you wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. Oblomov. L is love, which I think of as human love, or I love my dog, his name is Will Shakespeare, and I love my dog, and I love my children, and some of you I love. But there's a transcendent part of love. The Greeks call it agape, which is love like love for economics, love for science, love for baseball, love for soccer, love for God. That's the other part of L. The H and the F are hope and faith. Faith, hope, and love. These three abide. And the greatest is love. Hope is a forward-looking virtue of having a project. If you haven't got a project, if there's no point to exercising these more profane virtues, these top virtues being sacred virtues, if there's no point, if you have no goal, then you go home and shoot yourself. I don't recommend it. I would recommend that you try to find a hopeful goal. So, hope is the forward-looking virtue. You're walking in this direction. Faith is backwards. Faith is identity. Faith is integrity. Faith is where you come from. So I claim that these are an adequate philosophical vocabulary, and I use them to show you, try to show you, if my computer will turn on, that you can view economics and the history of economics. How can I say this? You'll get a fuller economics that does more of a job, or you'll correctly contextualize prudence only if you have something like these virtues in mind. As Frank Knight was saying, as early as 1923, the 19th century utilitarianism was in essence merely the ethics of power, glorified economics, as he called it. Its outcome was to reduce virtue to prudence. Hear what he said. That's reducing these other virtues. I regard prudence as a virtue, and St. Thomas did, St. Thomas Aquinas did, and Adam Smith did, and I do too, but reducing it. in Frank Knight's student, most famous student who we happen to have here, James Buchanan, I think, as in Frank Knight, as in all of us, we see a deep ethical question struggling with, struggling without a systematic ethical guide. Now, as an example, I want to take Martha Nussbaum's book of 2006, Frontiers of Justice, Disability, Nationality, Species Membership. Her book is an attempt to add love, L up here, to the accepted axioms of political philosophy. She criticizes on this count, the strictly Hobbesian, Goethe-esque contractarian assumption that prudence only will accomplish all we need for a, as Jim would say, for a good constitution. And she criticizes, too, the Lockean, John Rawlsian contractarian prudence with aversion of justice in Jem and Gordon Tulloch's famous book, which came out well before Rawls's book. There's this same idea that we'll have maximizing individuals, but they'll be, so to speak, tricked into being just in formulating constitutional rules by being behind a veil of ignorance, uncertainty, whatever. Now, of these earlier attempts to get a full set, or at least a society that we want to have, a desirable society, out of prudence only or prudence with a dash of justice, Martha says this, and I think this is very important. I think it implausible to suppose that one can extract justice from a starting point that does not include it in some form. And I believe that the purely prudential starting point, as in Hobbes, is likely to lead in a direction that is simply not the same as the direction we would take, now hear what she says, if we focused on ethical norms from the start. The test of a successful political theory is, does it result in a just society? I mean, big scale. Political theory, just as the test of a big scale economic theory is, does it result in efficiency, or still better, economic growth? And so norms are brought in at the end to decide whether or not this imagined political society is a good one or a bad one. And she says we should focus on ethical norms from the start. I think that's right. I think, alas, her book is subject to this critique. And here's how I express it. Think of a magician who's pulling rabbits from a hat. And he pulls out 7 rabbits. Well, I say, and so does Martha, except then she's subject to her own comment. I say you've got to have the rabbits in there at the beginning. They got to be in there. They're not going to breed in the hat, at least. They aren't going to somehow mysteriously get 7 birches out of 1 or 1.5. You got to have them in there. What we've done with utilitarianism, I'd like to say, is we've got, instead of nice cuddly rabbits, we've got a parrot, a stuffed parrot with glass eyes, a Victorian stuffed parrot. And for all that the salesman says, this is not a dead parrot. This is not a kaput, finished over parrot. He's pining for the fjords. That's not what it is. It's a dead parrot. And if you put a dead parrot in the hat of utilitarianism, all you're going to get out is a dead parrot society. So here's my conclusion. All this is in the paper. I've just outlined the paper. Here's the situation. If we use act utilitarianism, such as Samuelsonian economics suggests, without thinking about it too much, we will recommend, and by act utilitarianism, I mean you judge each act on matter of cost and benefit. Should we permit this particular abortion or not? And what comes to be recommended from such an ethical standing is planning. Right? Plans. And what it leaves unsolved, as Jim has pointed out, is rent seeking. So that doesn't work. So you move to constitutional political economy. You could frame it, you don't have to, but you could frame it as rule utilitarianism, by which I mean it doesn't have to be utilitarianism. Utilitarianism could be something else. And what that recommends is constitutions, rules about acts. That'll make it, that'll solve the problem of free riding and rent seeking. But I say that the problem then is motivating John Adams, Madison, and Jefferson to give us the right constitution. Spectacularly, in the matter of the treatment of slavery, they didn't. So I say, what we need is ethics. We need to stop banning serious ethical discussion from economics. Not vanilla chocolate ice cream ethics, not bad, what was the word you made? Yeah, not bad ideology, but serious considered ideology. And the recommendation there is that we get virtuous. As an important point, at least as economists, we should stop telling people that virtue talk is just preaching. You always call it that, just preaching. We should stop doing that. That had a terrible effect in the business schools, in the form of agency theory, which said, don't worry, Milton Friedman told me that the purpose of a corporate officer is to maximize the bottom line. If slave labor is involved, Who cares? That's not actually what Milton said in the article. If you go read the actual article, he didn't say that. He said the purpose of the corporate officer is to maximize the value of the firm, subject to the laws and ethics of the society. So that would be a concrete, sort of a concrete suggestion I'm making, is that we ought to get back to talking about ethical questions in economics in a philosophically sophisticated way, instead of just naively saying, oh, we can be scientists without ethics, and no, don't tell me, get thee behind me, Satan. That kind of talk is not going to be very helpful. But of course it has, this one leaves unsolved, although it solves all the others, because it solves the free riding problem, it solves motivating Adams and Madison and Jefferson, because that's how they were motivated, by the way. But it doesn't go very far to telling exactly how. So that's my argument. It's simply a framework for thinking about the role of ethics in the history of economics and in our own practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. Do you correlate the demise of ethical discussion with the rise of leftist ideology?
No. Although some kinds of leftist ideology partake in the strange 19th century idea. Again, it goes back to the science word and the role of the word science in our cultures. The strange 19th century view that if you were a scientist, that crowded out ethics. You know, historical materialism is an attempt to escape from ethical talk. It's very interesting. In the first volume of Capital, you won't find the German word for greed, which is Gier. You won't find it. So it's hardly ever there. Though we think of Marxist socialists as being very concerned with the evils of greed under capitalism. But Marx was trying to get away from ethical talk and trying to make his talk scientific. Now there's a kind of soft kind of socialism, which I espoused, although I was a Trotskyist for a while, but that was a passing phase, which there's a Christian socialism. And that is very powerful in the late 19th century. In a way, much of modern socialism, particularly in the United States, that is socialist impulses, comes not from this so-called scientific class analysis, but from Christianity reinterpreted the social gospel at the end of the 19th century. Yeah.
That is about where I was going. So through Western Civ, Aristotle, which is virtue theory, has largely been collectivist until the time period, 1800. Then the Enlightenment, Reformation, individualism is moving. So I hate to push you too much on the how, but these days the big question on the national debate is where's the firm line on the individual, right? The Tea Party and all this stuff, and going back to the U.S. Constitution. Jim Buchanan in his paper earlier said whatever rules you do come up with, the essence of those rules is they do have to be forced on others.
Yeah.
And that poses the huge question. So the rules have to be forced on others. Are we going to impose these virtues on others in the end?
No.
To what extent?
No, we're going to sweet talk them. We're going to persuade people. We're going to preach to them. And we're going to change their minds about viewing, that this is one of the main purposes of the book on the bourgeois virtues, change the minds of people in business, and most particularly the observers of business, to stop thinking of business as a evil rat race, and then you come home and you go to church. No. So I would quarrel with your collectivist individualist talk. I don't think that's quite right. I think in a lot of ways, Shakespeare's world is highly individualistic. These are SOBs in search of a rent. Most of his characters are.
Paola Tubaro, University of Greenwich. Thank you very much for this presentation. That was very interesting. My question is, well, it relates to what you said about the first discussion of ethics issues in the AEA, which was just dropped, which is very interesting. Now, my question is the ethical issue has come back to the fore recently. It's currently under discussion. So what I would like to ask is, in your view, what recent transformations in the discipline are making this possible now, which wasn't possible the first time, and whether you think it's going to be taken seriously now?
Well, I'm very actively involved in this, as is David. And I think, as a historian, social scientist, I'd say that it's because of the great recession that's taken seriously. I think that's foolish. I think that's a bad reason for taking it seriously, which makes me kind of nervous, because I don't think the great risk, although all my Marxist friends, of course, are thrilled at the great recession, because they think, aha, finally, the last crisis of capitalism. But they've been saying that since 1857. Every crisis is the last crisis of capitalism. So there's a lot of journalistic support, not necessarily that they're Marxists, but there's a lot of journalistic support for, well, what have we done wrong? Greed on Wall Street, which is, kind of absurd. If you've ever been on Wall Street, you know that greed is a constant.
Just a selfless plug, or selfish one. David and I organized a session at the Summer Institute on Ethics and Economics, and that was published in the Eastern, the number of papers, including one by us. So there aren't a lot of papers on this, but there are.
No, they're not.
Deirdre came to that day.
I did.
The ethics.
Okay.
Dan and David.
Okay. Mine's really a follow-up to the last set of issues. And I mean, one comment, first of all, my sense is a lot of what this recent thing in the AEA, you could maybe comment on this, is direct response to inside job. And insofar as there's direct evidence of conflict of interest of major economists issuing reports, and I think the profession realizes that's an embarrassment and a problem.
Well,
wait, if I could finish, my specific question, though, is when you're talking about the ethics of economists, is it ethics in general, or are there specific issues specific to economists that ought to be considered? So, I mean, conflict of interest in general is an issue we're seeing. I think these really fascinating issues now with, like, the head of the IMF and our Treasury, where personal life that's out, but if you do tax evasion, that's fine, and you can lead our Treasury system.
Yeah.
But there's this issue of, can you have a really lousy personal life and still be a good economist? And I think we can all, because this is being taped, I don't want to mention names, but I think we can all sort of come up with examples of people we think are really lousy people, not very nice people, and very suspicious in many ways, that have made major contributions to economics, that in many ways were better off. But so it raises the issue of, is there anything distinctive about being ethical as an economist?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I was so struggling sort of against that presumption that there's a separate ethics for economics that's kind of off to the side, and we don't need to worry about general ethical propositions. That I say the bourgeois virtues, but what those are is these 7 virtues in their commercial, market, innovative context. Courage in business is enterprise. Love in business is having a solidarity in an office, say, and so forth.
But you mentioned that, in your paper you mentioned Sanford Grossman. I remember when I was an undergraduate with him, he said one of the silliest questions that you ever saw asked George Stigler is assume that Stigler, have you ever met a paywall? If you haven't, why should we take you seriously as a business professor?
Yeah. Well, it's
Grossman thought that was the most ridiculous question he'd ever heard.
well, you know, I'm prepared to name names.
I just did.
And George Stigler and Sandy Grossman are 2 of the people I would have in mind as well, I don't know. I don't know how to answer it. It's an interesting question. I mean, obviously let me try to think of, well, if we give advice to the prince, we should believe it. I guess that's one ethical proposition that's peculiar to economists, because most people are not asked to give advice to the prince. You know, your average movie producer is not asked to be on the Council of Economic Advisors. So I suppose in our role, and I agree with Jim and his long-time suspicion about that role, in our role as advisors to the prince, we should be sincere. We should seek the truth honestly, and some people don't. You know, it's the old joke, tell me what you want to hear. I had a friend who actually had met a payroll, an economist, and he had started a consulting firm which had the strange business plan of telling the truth to the clients. So the clients would come and say, well, you know, we just wonder if these human resource arrangements we have are good or bad. And he would actually do research and say, no, they're lousy. I'd say, what? And he got bought out by KPMG, a great big accounting firm. And he said to them, guys, you know, for a large amount of money, $30 million, something like that. And he said, guys, you know, the business plan here is to tell the truth. And the guy from KPMG said, yeah, you bet we tell the truth. No, I mean it. It's going to be worthless if you don't tell the truth. Oh yeah, we'll tell the truth. You bet. And then, of course, within 6 months, they had ruined the business by merging it into the standard consulting model.
Where is honesty on this?
All the other virtues that you can think of, I regard these as primary colors, like blue and yellow and red, can be gotten from these. This is an analysis that you can find in St. Thomas Aquinas and in lots of other places. That honesty would be faith and justice and maybe some prudence mixed in. It'd be like purple.
Dan Hammond.
You get purple. You can't get red and blue from purple, but you can get purple from red and blue.
Deirdre, I'd like to go back to the beginning of your talk. If we take the old distinction between positive and normative,
Yeah.
and if we think of equate normative,
Please. Please.
if we accept it for a moment, if we take normative and ethical or ethics to be roughly the same, and then the other category is positive.
Yeah, positive.
And it seems to me there are two categories of positive statements, and the second one often gets put into the normative box. The first category of positive statements is the standard sort of economic question, an empirically testable statement.
Is the demand curve sloping?
Exactly. You may have difficulty testing it, but you think you can test it.
Yeah.
Then there's the second sort of positive statement, statements that are not empirically testable. And most of these many historical statements are of this sort, because they're statements about one-time events. So if I understood you right, you included the statement, Jesus is my personal Savior, in the normative box. I say that's in the positive box, but it's not testable. Every claim about Jesus is a claim about history, and therefore positive.
I go along with that partly. I mean, I'm an economic historian, among other things, and I just wrote a big book on economic history, and I think I can test various hypotheses about what caused the Industrial Revolution. And I do in the book. I have conclusions that I regard as positive, if we're going to stick with that vocabulary. I don't know, I see what you mean by the one-time untestability. I mean, it's the contrast between a science-based on metaphor, such as Newton or the theory of the consumer, and a science based on narrative, like the Austrian theory of invention or discovery. And those are two poles. And evolution is in some ways untestable, at least in the simple way we think of testing metaphorical theories. You know, if the moon suddenly jumps out of its orbit and goes off on a ride into space, you know, that will be a serious problem for Newton. Whereas if a species evolves a large brain and starts talking, you know, well, you know, that doesn't say that previous evolution was wrong. Yeah, I see what you mean, but as an evolutionary biologist would reply, we can also test in other ways the mechanisms of evolution.
I don't doubt that at all. My concern is that statements of that sort get shunted into the normative box of statements that we simply have to agree to disagree on, and we can't talk about it.
Oh, well, I agree with you there. And last, that's how, in some circles, down in Lynchburg, for example, that's how evolution is treated. When it shouldn't be. It's a scientific question. It's a narrative, but that doesn't mean it's not scientific and isn't subject to some kinds of tests. They just aren't as simple as the ones that Milton Friedman talked about in 1953.
I'm Vasily, an international student from Ukraine, and the issues of ethics have been always appealing to me.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'm thinking and reflecting on capitalism and ethics, and one of the works that comes to mind is Weber's Capitalism, Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism. And I'm thinking sometimes why capitalism was pretty much more or less successful in the United States, and it didn't quite work in such countries as Ukraine. And sometimes I am wondering maybe such ethical issues played a role here, because when I'm thinking about most charitable organizations coming from the United States,
Yeah.
and doing all this work, I would say that since this nation is grounded in Christian values and ethics and traditions, and Ukraine has been predominantly communist under Soviets. So what would you say on this matter? How possibly the ethical issues played out in the quasi-capitalism, as I will call it, in Ukraine?
Well, for one thing, I'd say you haven't given capitalism much of a trial. I urge you to keep doing it. Let's see. Yes, of course, ethics figure in an economy. And obviously, it's exactly like constitutional political economy. It would be really easy to solve all kinds of economic problems, contractual problems, for example, if most people were ethical. If most people are rats, or very interestingly, chimpanzees, which are economic men, quasi-homo economicus is what they are. They're very act utilitarian maximizing, right? So they just go for the immediate advantage, don't preach to me, they say. But I don't want to wave a magic wand. I don't want to say, oh, well, if everyone were nice and we linked arms and sang Kumbaya, we could have an efficient economy and a wonderful polity and so on and so forth. I say that in reality, in the business world, people act pretty ethically, pretty well. Of course, partly it's because they have to. If they don't, they get punished. But that wouldn't be my main argument. That's true, but it's not. That would be to reduce ethics to prudence only. And if prudence only were an adequate explanation of ethical behavior, then Ukraine would behave the same way that, I don't know, things in Massachusetts do. But I don't think you're right that, well, look, there's a lot of corruption in many places, and it doesn't completely kill economic growth. Chicago, I come from Chicago. Do I need to say anything more? And before that, I came from Massachusetts when it too was very corrupt. How do I come down here? It's very desirable not to preach to people that prudence only is all you need. And alas, that's what the economists keep saying. They say, oh, we need incentives. Let's arrange incentives. Let's not rely on people's ethical behavior. But that's actually how economies and science work. We could all lie about our results all the time as scientists. And it's sometimes very hard to check, but we don't on the whole. So we're ethical beings. In fact, there's a substantial body of evidence in evolutionary biology that we are ethical beings, we're not just grass. In fact, what makes us human is all the virtues above P. Because lions aren't courageous. Lions don't exercise courage. They're just prudent. When they come to an elephant, they run away. If they come to a rabbit, they attack. Neither of those is courageous. Hope that got it. We'll talk some more.
Working in the space you laid out is enormously difficult, as you know from the next edition of your textbook. Maybe instead of working with such high dimension, we can just put in language, which would cover all of them. Well, I mean, not naturally. It's not trivially, but with work. And you may have to do some on some of this stuff, but we know how to do that. But working with language, then we've got, I would bet, enough to be able to go on and be able to.
I'm very interested in that suggestion because my next book is called A Treasured Bourgeoisie, How Innovation Became Ethical 1600 to 1848. But the book after that, number 4, it's going to be a boxed set, like Harry Potter, and I'm going to die happy. The 4th volume is going to be called Bourgeois Rhetoric, Language and Interest in the Age of the Industrial Revolution. And as you say, you can, in a favorite phrase of yours, David, you can back out a lot of ethics from the ethics of conversing. And some people have done that. Grice, for example, the philosopher, and Austin, and Searle, and so forth, do that sort of stuff. It's rather, the suggestion you're making is rather similar to the one that Amartya Sen has engaged in, which is to throw all this into the word commitment. Throw everything other than prudence into the word, into the notion of commitment, where you're committed to ethical behavior contrary to your prudent interests.
I'm Young from George Mason University. And you almost said, or at least give the impression that ethics is a subject of the Western civilization.
Yeah, I was going to modify that.
Confucius and Gautama Buddha were very much concerned about ethics. My first question is, why their concept of ethics look so different from, what you're talking about?
Well, it's
not.
not.
My second question related to that is, if Eastern Asian countries or Asian countries become more commercial society, then would their ethical system become more like what you described in this book?
No, because I, in fact, in the book, I talk a lot about the East. I talk a lot about Confucianism, for example. I talk some about South Asian, also commercial ethics. I don't talk about it anywhere near as much as I talk about ethics in the West, but my point in talking about these other places is to make the completely obvious point that all human societies have to have an approximate, or don't have to, there's no logical reason they have to, but in evolutionary terms and in terms of surviving as societies, they all have to have some versions of all of this. So you can go to Confucius himself, and you can look, he's a virtue ethicist, and you can look at the virtues that he emphasizes, and you can map them onto these. So I don't think there's anything peculiarly Western about it, which means that Japan was able to grow at fantastic rates, and China is able to grow at, and South Korea, and Taiwan at even more fantastic rates. And now South Asia is growing at fantastic rates without ethical change. So I'm not sure what I'm to conclude from that, but I don't regard ethics as what made the West. The one thing I do claim, and this I claim in this second book, is a change in the attitude towards merchants and innovators did happen. That did happen, and now it's happening elsewhere. So it was a sociological change that made the modern world. I'm fond of saying that I spent the first half of my career as an economic historian especially, saying that sociology had nothing to do with economic history. And I seem to be condemned to spend the last half of my career as an economic historian claiming it has everything to do with economic history. So +1 minus 1 equals 0. No. It's very depressing.
More for a way of diversification.
Yeah.
Do we have time? With apologies for my voice. As always, a lot of what you're talking about resonates with Adam Smith. And I'm just wanting to ask you, I was going to have a preface, but I'll get right to it. Your favorite example of how Smith and his virtue ethics show up in his account of commercial society?
My favorite example?
Just how the moral sentiments speak to the to commercial society, yes.
Well, to go back to David's point, in various places, unfortunately they were only hints, but he hints pretty strongly. He's nudging us pretty strongly. He started, by the way, as a high school teacher of English. That was his first job, essentially. Is to claim that exchange and conversation are homologous, and that they support each other. And that insight is one that I'm, in this volume 4, I'm very interested in. So I made a calculation, a factual empirical calculation, an estimate of what percentage of national income is earned in sweet talk, as I call it, persuasion. Not advertising. Well, yeah, advertising is a small part of it, but that's a small part. Not orders, not information transmittal, but persuasion. Will you please come to work tomorrow on time? Will you please buy my product? Hey, how about financing my venture here? And you know how high it is? It's 1/4 of national income. Supervisors, teachers, lawyers, judges, social workers, police, all of them spend much of their time, much of their marginal product, so to speak, is earned from their persuasive abilities. So there's a lot to be done in the overlap, as David suggests, between economics and language, linguistics, and as David also suggests, the ethical and the conversational are connected. My claim is that an Austrian view, like Israel Kirzner's, of discovery lacks one thing, which is sweet talk, persuasion. Because after the entrepreneur has alertly noticed an arbitrage opportunity, she has to persuade as a manager, as a client of a bank, as a seller of a good. She's got a lot of she's got to persuade herself, she's got to persuade her husband, she's got to persuade a lot of people that this makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dirk. There should be a refresh of coffee and so on out there. We'll take a quick 15-minute break and then reconvene right at 25 to. So I don't want to get much beyond 5 minutes late. Thanks, that was great.
Here's the No, I have books on that, so.